The F-35 Lightning II fighter jet sat silent and broken on the tarmac like a $30 million paperweight. Its sleek stealth profile mocking every engineer who'd tried to fix it. For 6 days, the most advanced aircraft in the world had defeated every diagnostic protocol, every troubleshooting manual, every expert consultation. But Admiral Victoria Sterling was about to make a decision that would shatter everything she thought she knew about the quiet contractor who'd been watching from the shadows, and reveal a legend she never suspected was hiding in plain sight. The morning sun blazed across Oceana Naval Air Station with the intensity of a military inspection, casting razor-sharp shadows between the massive hangars where America's deadliest aircraft waited for their next mission. The air thrummed with controlled violence, the distant roar of afterburners, the sharp crack of ordnance being loaded, and the metallic symphony of a carrier air wing preparing for deployment. Admiral Victoria Sterling moved through this choreographed chaos like a storm front, her presence bending conversations toward silence and straightening spines before she'd even spoken a word. At 45, she commanded respect, not through volume, but through an aura of absolute competence that had carried her through 30 years of naval aviation and into the rarefied air of flag rank. Her service dress blues were flawless, 4 gold admiral stripes catching the morning light like liquid authority. Behind her, a nervous cluster of junior officers struggled to match her pace, while frantically updating readiness reports on their tablets. Each step Victoria took seemed to compress the very air around them, building pressure like an engine about to exceed redline. 18%, she said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise with surgical precision. The words weren't shouted. Victoria Sterling had never needed to shout. 18% of our strike fighters are down for maintenance. That's not a statistic, gentlemen. That's a catastrophic failure of leadership that ends careers and loses wars. Captain James Morrison, her chief of staff, cleared his throat like a man preparing for a firing squad. Ma'am, the complexity of the F-35 systems presents unique challenges. Challenges we trained for. Victoria cut him off with the efficiency of a blade-severing rope. These aircraft represent the pinnacle of American air superiority. Our maintenance protocols should reflect that standard, not make excuses for failing to meet it. She stopped abruptly in front of Hangar 7, her entourage stumbling to avoid collision, like ships trying not to ram their flagship. The sudden halt sent a ripple of tension through the group. When Admiral Sterling stopped walking, it usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Lightning 07, she said, the aircraft's tail number falling from her lips like a verdict. Status report. Now. Morrison's fingers flew across his tablet screen with the desperation of a man defusing a bomb. Avionics fault, ma'am. Multiple cascading system failures. Crew chief reports 6 days down with no clear path to resolution. 6 days. The number hit Victoria like a physical blow. 6 days of a $115 million weapon sitting useless while somewhere in the world, potential adversaries noted America's inability to keep its most advanced fighters airborne. 6 days of questions from Washington, doubts from allies, and microscopic erosions of the reputation she'd spent 3 decades building. Her jaw tightened with the controlled fury of a professional who'd built her entire identity around competence, only to watch that competence fail when it mattered most. Show me. The hangar's interior yawned before them like the inside of a steel cathedral, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows 40 feet overhead. Work lights cast harsh pools of illumination over the wounded F-35, its access panels hanging open like surgical incisions, revealing the aircraft's electronic nervous system. Cables snaked across the mirror-polished concrete floor, and the air carried the familiar cocktail of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the sharp ozone scent of electronics under stress. Near the aircraft's nose, A maintenance crew clustered around a diagnostic cart that beeped and chirped with electronic disapproval, its screens painting their faces in alternating patterns of green and red light. Their body language told the story before any words were spoken. Shoulders slumped with defeat, voices carrying the frustrated edge of professionals who'd hit an immovable wall. Still showing cascading faults across multiple systems, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was saying, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the hangar's controlled climate. We've replaced the main processor, reseated every connection twice, even swapped the entire avionics bay from Lightning 09. Petty Officer, Chen nodded grimly, his uniform bearing the stains of 6 days' worth of intensive troubleshooting. Ran every diagnostic protocol in the technical manual, some of them 3 times. The bird keeps throwing different error codes every time we cycle power. Like the systems are having an argument with each other in a language we don't speak. Chief Petty Officer Maxwell, a 22-year veteran whose weathered face had seen every possible mechanical malfunction that could plague military aircraft, shook his head with the weary confusion of a man whose expertise had finally met its match. Never seen anything like it, Admiral. It's not following any documented failure pattern. The fault seems to shift and evolve every time we think we've isolated it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Victoria approached the diagnostic cart, her presence immediately transforming the atmosphere like a high-pressure front moving through. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Backs straightened to attention. The ambient tension ratcheted up several degrees as everyone suddenly became aware that their professional competence was being evaluated in real time. 6 days, Victoria said, her voice carrying just enough edge to remind everyone that this wasn't merely a technical discussion. This was about mission readiness, squadron capability, and the kind of failure that generated congressional inquiries. What's preventing resolution? Maxwell stepped forward, his bearing respectful but not deferential. He'd been troubleshooting military aircraft since before Admiral Sterling made lieutenant commander, and experience had taught him to speak truth to power, even when power preferred comfortable lies. Ma'am, we're dealing with an intermittent fault that's affecting multiple systems simultaneously. The aircraft's built-in diagnostic systems are designed to isolate failures, but something is causing cascade effects across supposedly unrelated networks. Every time we think we've identified the root cause, the fault pattern shifts and presents differently. Victoria studied the diagnostic readouts, scrolling across the cart's main screen. The data looked like electronic hieroglyphics. She was a pilot and a flag officer, not a systems technician, but she understood enough to see the scope of the problem. Multiple critical systems showing amber and red status indicators, error codes that seemed to shift and mutate like living things, performance parameters that flickered between normal and catastrophically degraded. The weight of command settled on her shoulders like a familiar burden. Above her, Pentagon officials expected results. Around her, hundreds of sailors and aviators depended on her leadership. In front of her, the most sophisticated fighter aircraft ever built sat broken. Maintaining it had reached the limits of their expertise. Assessment for return to full mission capability? She asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. Maxwell exchanged glances with his team, the kind of look that passed between professionals who'd already had this conversation multiple times in private and reached the same unsatisfactory conclusion each time. Honestly, ma'am, we might be looking at weeks. This kind of system interaction fault could require factory-level diagnostics. We might need to ship critical components back to Lockheed Martin for analysis and replacement. The words hit Victoria like rounds from a sniper's rifle. Weeks. Factory involvement. The kind of maintenance nightmare that generated congressional hearings, ended careers, and provided ammunition for critics who questioned America's military readiness. She felt her jaw muscles clench despite her efforts to maintain the stone-faced composure expected of flag officers. "Unacceptable," she said quietly, the single word carrying more destructive force than if she'd screamed it at the top of her lungs. "This aircraft represents more than $100 million of American taxpayer investment. Telling me it needs to return to the factory because my maintenance team can't diagnose an electrical fault is not an option I'm prepared to accept." The hangar fell into the kind of silence that accompanies moments when careers hang in the balance. Victoria was acutely aware that her voice had carried, that other maintenance crews throughout the massive space had stopped their work to listen, that this conversation was becoming a very public test of leadership, competence, and the ability to deliver results when conventional approaches failed. Maxwell's expression remained professionally neutral, but Victoria caught the subtle tightening around his eyes. He was a good man, a competent chief, but he'd just run face first into the limits of his expertise. And now he was being asked to magically transcend those limits because the operational schedule and political reality demanded it. "Ma'am," Maxwell said carefully, choosing his words like a man navigating a minefield, "my team has exhausted every troubleshooting procedure documented in our technical manuals. We've consulted with factory technical representatives via secure video conference. We've reached out to other air wings that have encountered similar issues. This particular fault pattern appears to be unprecedented in the maintenance community's collective experience." Victoria nodded, understanding intellectually that Maxwell was being thorough and professional, following established protocols and covering every possible base. But understanding didn't diminish the crushing weight of operational reality. Above her, flag officers expected miracles. Around her, the tempo of military operations demanded solutions, not explanations. "Who else has access to this aircraft?" she asked, her sharp gaze sweeping across the hangar like a searchlight looking for targets of opportunity. "The full qualified maintenance crew, ma'am," Rodriguez answered promptly. "Everyone with appropriate clearances and F-35 systems training." Victoria's tactical mind began cataloging personnel and resources, looking for angles that hadn't been explored, capabilities that hadn't been fully utilized. Her gaze swept methodically across the hangar, taking inventory of the human assets moving between aircraft with the purposeful efficiency of military professionals executing familiar tasks. Most wore the standard Navy working uniform digital blue camouflage that looked like pixelated ocean waves. Senior petty officers sported khaki uniforms that marked them as chiefs and senior chiefs, the backbone of naval technical expertise. Everyone moved with the economical precision of people who understood that mistakes in this environment could cost lives and destroy equipment worth more than most people's houses. But one figure caught her attention, standing out precisely because he was trying so hard not to. He worked alone near the far wall, older than the others by perhaps a decade, wearing coveralls that had seen considerable use but were meticulously maintained. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his movements carried the economical precision of someone who'd learned to work efficiently in confined spaces where every motion counted. He was installing what appeared to be an avionics panel in another F-35, his hands moving with the kind of unconscious certainty that spoke to years of intimate familiarity with the aircraft's systems. There was something in his posture, something in the way he held himself, that triggered recognition circuits deep in Victoria's memory. Not his face. She was certain she'd never met him. But something about his bearing, his spatial awareness, the way he moved around the aircraft as if he owned every inch of it. "Who's that?" Victoria asked, nodding toward the solitary figure. Maxwell followed her gaze, his expression shifting slightly. "That's Marcus Webb, ma'am. Civilian contractor. He handles specialized maintenance tasks on a contract basis." "Contractor?" Victoria repeated, her tone carefully neutral, while her mind immediately began processing implications. In her experience, civilian contractors in military maintenance environments fell into distinct categories. Either high-end specialists who commanded premium wages for unique expertise, or cost-cutting alternatives who performed routine tasks for less money than military personnel. "What's his background?" she asked. Maxwell's hesitation was brief, but noticeable. "Details are somewhat limited, ma'am. He's been assigned here approximately 18 months. Security clearance is current. Work quality is exceptional, but he tends to keep a low profile. Never seen him stumped by any mechanical or electronic problem, no matter how complex." Victoria studied the contractor more carefully. Her trained eye, picking up subtle details that painted a picture her conscious mind was only beginning to assemble. The way he moved around the aircraft suggested more than just familiarity. It suggested ownership, the kind of unconscious spatial relationship that came from years of working in confined cockpits, where every switch, every display, every control surface was as familiar as the features of your own face. His tool handling was too efficient, too economical. Every motion served a purpose. Nothing wasted, nothing unnecessary. It was the kind of muscle memory that came from working in environments where inefficiency could be fatal, where speed and precision weren't just job requirements, but survival skills. "Has he examined Lightning 07? Victoria asked. "No, ma'am," Maxwell replied promptly. "Contractor personnel aren't authorized to work on mission-critical avionics systems without direct military supervision and specific task. Authorization. Security protocols require—" "I understand the protocols, Chief," Victoria interrupted, her mind already moving beyond bureaucratic restrictions toward practical solutions. Here she had a maintenance crisis that was threatening squadron readiness, and 20 feet away stood someone who might possess the expertise to resolve it, but wasn't being utilized because of administrative boundaries that seemed suddenly arbitrary. She made a decision that felt both tactically sound and professionally risky. If her regular maintenance team had exhausted their expertise, and if factory support meant weeks of delay, then she needed to explore unconventional options. "Mr. Webb?" she called out, her voice carrying across the hangar with the kind of authority that stopped conversations and turned heads throughout the massive space. The contractor looked up from his work, and for just a moment so brief, Victoria almost missed it. Something flickered across his expression. Recognition, perhaps. Or wariness. A subtle shift that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd heard that particular tone of command, before his face settled into neutral professionalism. He set down his tools with deliberate care, straightened to his full height, and walked over with a gait that was steady, unhurried, and somehow familiar in a way that made Victoria's tactical instincts ping with interest. Up close, more details emerged that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. His coveralls were well maintained, but showed the kind of honest wear that came from years of actual hands-on work rather than supervisory duties. His hands bore the small scars and permanent stains that marked someone who'd spent substantial time working with metal, electronics, and precision instruments under demanding conditions. But it was his eyes that captured Victoria's attention and held it. Dark blue, alert, carrying a depth that suggested he'd seen considerably more than routine maintenance work. There was intelligence there, but also something else. A kind of controlled watchfulness that she recognized from her own mirror. The look of someone accustomed to making split-second decisions under pressure. Yes, ma'am? He said, his voice quiet but clear, carrying just enough respect to be proper without being deferential. Victoria extended her hand, a gesture that surprised several of the junior officers watching. Protocol didn't require her to shake hands with a civilian contractor, but she'd learned that small gestures of respect often yielded large dividends in cooperation and information. Marcus Webb, correct? I'm Admiral Sterling. Marcus took her hand briefly, his grip firm without being aggressive, lasting exactly the appropriate duration. Yes, ma'am? How can I assist you? Victoria gestured toward the troubled lightning. We have an aircraft that's been down for 6 days, with complex systems faults, multiple cascading failures across supposedly unrelated avionics networks. My maintenance team has exhausted standard troubleshooting procedures. She paused, watching his face carefully for any reaction. I'm told you have extensive experience with F-35 systems. Marcus glanced toward the aircraft, and Victoria saw his expression shift in a way that made her pulse quicken slightly. Not concern, exactly, but the look of someone processing information and forming rapid assessments based on experience that went deeper than he was revealing. I perform routine maintenance tasks, he said carefully. Panel replacements, basic system checks, standard diagnostics, nothing involving classified mission systems or sensitive avionics. But Victoria heard something in his voice, caught something in the way his eyes lingered on the diagnostic displays that suggested his answer was technically accurate, but incomplete. You understand the aircraft's systems architecture, though, how the different computers communicate and integrate. A longer pause. Marcus seemed to be weighing his words with the care of someone who understood that conversations with flag officers could have far-reaching consequences. I understand the basic network topology. Yes, ma'am. Again, technically accurate, but somehow inadequate. Victoria sensed layers beneath his careful responses, knowledge and experience being deliberately constrained by boundaries she couldn't yet identify. The morning was advancing, and every minute of delay represented another minute of diminished squadron capability, another tick of the clock toward missing critical deployment schedules. Victoria made the kind of decision that had carried her to flag rank bold, calculated, willing to accept risk in pursuit of mission accomplishment. Mr. Webb, I want you to examine this aircraft, not to perform unauthorized maintenance, but to provide consultation. A fresh perspective on a problem that has stumped some of the Navy's best avionics technicians. Marcus looked between the Admiral and Chief Maxwell, his expression unreadable, but suggesting internal calculations that went beyond simple technical assessment. Ma'am, I appreciate the confidence, but this appears to be a mission systems issue that requires specialized clearances and authorization levels that exceed my Mr. Webb. Victoria interrupted, her voice taking on the tone she reserved for moments when polite requests weren't achieving required results. I have a $115 million aircraft that's been deadlined for nearly a week. I have a maintenance team that's reached the limits of documented procedures. And I have a contractor with demonstrated F-35 systems knowledge standing 20 feet away. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to conversational level, while somehow becoming more commanding. I'm not asking you to perform unauthorized maintenance or access classified systems. I'm asking you to examine diagnostic data and provide your professional assessment of what might be causing these cascading failures. The hangar had grown noticeably quieter around them. Other maintenance crews had paused their work to observe this unusual exchange between a flag officer and a civilian contractor. Victoria was aware that she was putting both herself and Marcus in an awkward position. Protocol suggested she should work through established channels, requisition factory support, accept the delays that came with following documented procedures. But Victoria hadn't reached flag rank by accepting delays when mission accomplishment was at stake. She'd built her reputation on finding solutions when conventional approaches failed. And right now, conventional approaches were failing in spectacular fashion. Marcus studied the aircraft for a long moment, then looked back at Victoria. Something in his expression had shifted, a subtle change that suggested he was making his own kind of calculated decision. "I'll take a look at the diagnostic data," he said quietly. "But I can't make any guarantees about what I might find." "Understood," Victoria replied. "Chief Maxwell, please brief Mr. Webb on the symptoms and provide him access to the diagnostic information." As Maxwell led Marcus toward the diagnostic cart, Victoria stepped back to observe, her tactical mind analyzing the developing situation from multiple angles. She was taking a calculated risk. If the contractor couldn't provide useful insights, she'd lost nothing but time. If he could help identify the problem, she might save days or weeks of maintenance delays and avoid the political nightmare of returning a combat aircraft to the factory. But as she watched Marcus study the scrolling data streams on the diagnostic displays, something told her this situation was about to become far more complex than simple aircraft maintenance. There was something in the way he moved around the Lightning, something in how quickly he absorbed and processed the technical information that suggested knowledge and experience well beyond what any routine contractor should possess. His questions to Maxwell were too specific, too targeted, reflecting an understanding of F-35 systems integration that typically required years of specialized training and access to classified technical documentation. Marcus spent 30 minutes reviewing diagnostic data with Maxwell and the maintenance team, his manner becoming increasingly confident as he identified patterns and relationships that others had apparently missed. Victoria watched from a distance as he requested specific tests, examined particular readouts, and occasionally asked for certain procedures to be repeated with subtle modifications. Finally, he straightened up from the diagnostic cart and walked back to where Victoria waited, his expression carrying a new note of certainty that made her pulse accelerate with anticipation. "Admiral," he said, his voice still quiet, but now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. "I believe I've identified your problem." Victoria felt her breath catch slightly. "Proceed." "You have corrupted firmware in the central mission computer," Marcus said with clinical precision. "The corruption is subtle enough to pass standard error-checking protocols, but significant enough to introduce timing delays in data processing. When multiple systems attempt to access the CMC simultaneously, these delays cause timeout errors that cascade through the integrated network architecture." Maxwell had followed Marcus over and was listening with obvious fascination. "We replaced the central mission computer," he interjected. "Swapped it with a known good unit from Lightning 09. Marcus nodded, as if he'd expected this response. "But you transferred the configuration files from the original computer to maintain aircraft-specific calibrations and settings." He looked directly at Victoria. "The corruption would have transferred with those files, reinfecting the loose, replacement hardware." Victoria felt a surge of hope tempered by professional skepticism. The diagnosis sounded plausible, but she'd learned to be cautious about elegant solutions to complex problems in her experience. The simple answers were often wrong. "How can you be certain of this diagnosis?" she asked. For the first time since they'd begun this conversation, Marcus hesitated. It was a brief pause, lasting perhaps 2 seconds. But Victoria caught it the moment when he realized his answer might reveal considerably more about his background than he intended to share. "I've encountered this specific failure mode before," he said carefully. "The symptom pattern is distinctive." "Where?" Victoria pressed, her instincts now fully engaged. "What aircraft?" What circumstances? The question hung in the air between them like an unexploded ordnance. Victoria could sense Maxwell and several other maintenance personnel watching this exchange, aware that something significant was happening, but uncertain exactly what. Marcus met her gaze directly, and for a moment, Victoria saw something in his eyes that made her heart rate spike. Not fear or evasion, but the look of someone making a critical decision about how much truth to reveal. Various operational environments, he said finally, over the course of several years. It wasn't really an answer, and they both knew it. But before Victoria could push harder, Marcus continued with increased confidence. The solution is straightforward if my diagnosis is correct. Complete firmware reload from original source media. No transferred files. No inherited configurations. It will require recalibrating all aircraft-specific parameters, but that's a few hours of documented procedures versus weeks of troubleshooting and potential factory involvement. Victoria studied his face intently, looking for any indication of uncertainty or deception. What she found was quiet confidence, not arrogance, but the assurance of someone who possessed deep knowledge and wasn't guessing. "Chief Maxwell," she said, without breaking eye contact with Marcus. "Assessment of this proposed solution?" Maxwell was clearly processing multiple factors: technical feasibility, risk assessment, and the growing mystery of how a civilian contractor had diagnosed a problem that had stumped military specialists. "It's theoretically sound, ma'am," he said slowly. "We didn't consider firmware corruption because our diagnostic protocols indicated successful error checking. But if the corruption was subtle enough to pass those checks while still affecting timing..." He paused, thinking through the implications. It would explain the seemingly random error patterns and the way fault symptoms kept shifting. Victoria made her decision with the swift certainty that had characterized her entire career. Execute the solution. Complete firmware reload per Mr. Webb's recommendation. "Yes, ma'am," Maxwell responded promptly. "We'll need approximately 4 hours for complete reload and recalibration. Keep me informed of progress," Victoria ordered. Then she turned back to Marcus, her expression carrying a mixture of gratitude and growing suspicion. "Mr. Webb, if your diagnosis proves correct, you'll have saved the Navy considerable time, resources, and potential embarrassment." Marcus nodded politely, his demeanor remaining professionally neutral. "Just attempting to contribute where possible, ma'am." Victoria watched him walk back to his workstation, her mind now churning with questions that went far beyond aircraft maintenance. His diagnosis had been too quick, too certain, too specific for someone whose official role was routine maintenance tasks. The way he'd immediately identified a complex failure mode suggested experience and knowledge that exceeded what any civilian contractor should possess. But it was more than just technical expertise. There had been something in his bearing, his unconscious mannerisms, the way he'd examined the aircraft that triggered recognition patterns deep in her memory. Military bearing, combat experience, the kind of intuitive understanding that came from years of working with these systems under operational conditions. 4 hours later, Victoria returned to Hangar 7 to find Lightning 07 powered up and cycling through complete systems checks. The diagnostic screens that had been painting angry red error messages for 6 days now showed solid green status indicators across every critical system. Maxwell approached her with the satisfied expression of a chief who'd just accomplished the impossible. "Complete success, ma'am," he reported with barely contained pride. Mr. Webb's diagnosis was precisely accurate. Corrupted firmware, causing timing delays under load conditions. The complete reload eliminated every fault symptom. Victoria felt a surge of professional satisfaction mixed with intensifying curiosity. "Where is Mr. Webb?" Completed his shift. and departed approximately an hour ago, ma'am." "But Admiral—" Maxwell paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase his next statement. "Speak freely, Chief. That diagnosis shouldn't have been possible for someone with his documented clearance level and official responsibilities. The timing protocols he described, the specific failure modes he identified, the depth of understanding of integrated systems architecture." Maxwell shook his head slowly. "That level of expertise requires years of specialized training and access to classified technical documentation that goes well beyond routine maintenance procedures." Victoria nodded, her tactical mind already working on the implications. She'd reached the same conclusion, and it led to some very intriguing questions about exactly who Marcus Webb was, and where he'd acquired knowledge that exceeded what his official position should allow. "Chief, I want you to pull Mr. Webb's personnel file and security clearance documentation. Everything we have on his background, previous employment, technical qualifications." "Yes, ma'am." "May I ask why?" Victoria looked back at the now functional Lightning, its systems humming in perfect electronic harmony thanks to the diagnostic brilliance of a man who was supposedly just a routine contractor. "Because in my experience, Chief, when someone possesses knowledge they're not supposed to have, it usually means they once held positions they're no longer authorized to discuss." She turned to face Maxwell directly. "And in the naval aviation community, there are very few places where someone could acquire the kind of deep systems expertise Mr. Dulio Webb just demonstrated." As she left the hangar, Victoria's mind was already formulating plans for a much more comprehensive conversation with contractor Webb. A conversation that would probably reveal exactly why he seemed so familiar. Why his hands moved around an F-35 with such unconscious certainty, and why he carried himself like someone who'd once worn wings of gold. Tomorrow, she decided, she was going to discover exactly who Marcus Webb really was, and something in her gut told her the answer was going to be far more interesting than a maintenance technician with exceptional troubleshooting skills. The evening sun cast long shadows across the base as Victoria finally headed home, her mind still processing the day's extraordinary events. Behind her, F-35 Lightning 07 sat mission-ready, its complex systems functioning flawlessly, thanks to the expertise of a man who was clearly far more than he appeared to be. By tomorrow, Victoria intended to know exactly who Marcus Webb was, and she had a growing suspicion that when she found out, it was going to change everything she thought she knew about the quiet contractor who'd just saved her squadron from a maintenance disaster that could have ended careers. Victoria Sterling had never been one to let mysteries fester, especially when they involved operational, security, and personnel with unexplained expertise. By 0600 hours the next morning, she was already seated in her office with Marcus Webb's personnel file spread across her desk, like evidence at a crime scene, and what she found made her blood run cold with recognition. The official documentation was sparse, almost suspiciously so. Marcus Webb, age 42, civilian contractor employed through Northrop Grumman's maintenance division. Security clearance. Secret. Renewed 18 months prior. Previous employment listed as various aviation maintenance positions with gaps in the timeline that could accommodate anything from unemployment to classified assignments that couldn't be documented in standard personnel files. But it was the photograph clipped to the inside cover that stopped Victoria's breath in her throat. The face was older now, weathered by years and marked by lines that spoke of responsibilities carried in silence. The dark hair showed more silver, and there was something different around the eyes, a sadness that hadn't been there before. But the bone structure was unmistakable, the set of the jaw, the way he held his head, even in a simple ID photo. She knew this face. had seen it in briefing rooms and ready rooms, captured in the background of official photographs from carrier operations she'd participated in years ago. But it was the name on the tip of her tongue that made her hands tremble slightly as she reached for her secure phone. "Commander Sarah Mitchell, Naval Personnel Command," came the crisp voice after 2 rings. "Sarah, this is Admiral Sterling at Oceana. I need you to run a classified personnel search for me. Strictly compartmented, eyes only." "Of course, ma'am. What parameters?" Victoria looked at the photograph again, her memory assembling pieces of a puzzle she'd been carrying for nearly 2 decades. "I need everything you can find on a pilot, callsign Viper, who flew F-18 Super Hornets, approximately 15 to FI, 20 years ago. Exceptional pilot, possibly involved in classified operations." The pause on the other end told Victoria that Commander Mitchell had found something significant. "Admiral, that's going to require special authorization. That file is sealed under 'I have the authorization.'" Victoria cut her off. "This is a matter of operational security. I need that information within the hour." 45 minutes later, Victoria's secure computer chimed with an encrypted file transfer that would change everything she thought she understood about the quiet contractor who'd saved her squadron from disaster. As the classified document opened on her screen, pieces of a story began emerging that made her chest tighten with a mixture of awe and heartbreak. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Viper Webb, naval flight officer turned pilot, decorated combat veteran, and one of the most legendary aviators in recent Navy history. The file contained mission reports that read like fiction, single-handed rescue operations behind enemy lines, impossible intercepts that had saved countless lives, flying skills that had earned him a reputation as the pilot other pilots aspired to become. But it was the final entries in his service record that made Victoria's throat constrict with sudden understanding. Personal tragedy, family loss, medical disqualification, voluntary resignation from active duty under circumstances that remained classified but clearly involved sacrifice on a scale that most people couldn't comprehend. The file painted a picture of a man who'd given everything to serve his country, lost everything that mattered to him personally, and then quietly disappeared into civilian life, rather than accept the recognition and benefits his service had earned. Victoria sat back in her chair, pieces of memory clicking into place like ammunition being loaded into a weapon. She'd heard the stories, whispered in ready rooms, and passed along through the informal networks that connected naval aviators across decades of service. Viper, the ghost pilot who could make an F-18 do things that defied physics and logic. The man who'd once landed a severely damaged aircraft on a carrier deck in weather that should have made it impossible, saving not just his own life, but preventing a potential collision that could have killed dozens. And now he was fixing her aircraft while hiding his identity behind the cover of a routine maintenance contractor. Victoria's tactical mind immediately began processing implications. Why was he here? Why was he hiding his identity? What circumstances had led one of the Navy's most legendary pilots to take a job as a civilian contractor, working on the same aircraft he'd once flown in combat? The answers, she suspected, lay in the classified portions of his file that remained beyond even her clearance level. But she intended to find out, because if Marcus Webb was working in her area of responsibility while concealing his true background, she needed to understand the reasons. More importantly, she'd begun to suspect that yesterday's aircraft maintenance issue might not have been the random coincidence it appeared to be. That afternoon, Victoria found herself walking through the base commissary with no particular mission except to think, her mind churning through the implications of what she'd discovered. The familiar environment of military families shopping for groceries, children playing in the aisles while their parents compared prices, provided a comforting backdrop for processing information that had fundamentally shifted her understanding of recent events. She was examining apples with the kind of intense focus that had nothing to do with fruit quality when she heard a familiar voice from the next aisle over. "Dad, can we get the cereal with the airplane on the box? Please?" Victoria's pulse accelerated as she recognized the quiet, warm tone that had answered her challenge about the F-35 just 24 hours earlier. Moving carefully to avoid detection, she positioned herself where she could observe without being seen. Marcus Webb stood in the breakfast cereal aisle, his attention focused entirely on a girl who appeared to be about 8 years old. She had dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, bright eyes full of intelligence and mischief, and was currently engaged in what appeared to be a serious negotiation about nutritional value versus entertainment packaging. "Sophia," Marcus said gently, "that sugar is not a food group." The girl replied, with the resigned tone of someone who'd had this conversation before. "But Dad, it has vitamins added. See?" She pointed to the nutrition label with the earnestness of a lawyer presenting evidence. Marcus chuckled, the sound carrying warmth that Victoria hadn't heard in his voice during their official interactions. "Nice try, counselor. But I think we can find something with vitamins that doesn't also contain enough sugar to fuel a fighter jet." If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Sophia giggled at the fighter jet reference, clearly delighted by her father's humor. "Okay, but next time, can we get the one with the submarine? Submarines are almost as cool as airplanes." "We'll consider it," Marcus agreed, selecting a box of whole-grain cereal that apparently met his nutritional standards, while Sophia made exaggerated, disappointed faces that were clearly more performance than genuine distress. Victoria found herself transfixed by this glimpse into Marcus's private life. The man she'd met yesterday had been professional, competent, but reserved to the point of being almost mysterious. This version relaxed, playful, completely focused on his daughter's happiness, revealed layers of personality that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. She was about to quietly retreat when Sophia suddenly darted around the end of the aisle, nearly colliding with Victoria in her enthusiasm to reach something on a higher shelf. "Oh, excuse me," Sophia said politely, looking up at Victoria with the kind of fearless curiosity that marked children who'd been raised with confidence and security. "No problem at all," Victoria replied, automatically smiling at the girl's earnest expression. "Are you shopping with your dad?" "Yes, ma'am. We're getting supplies for our camping trip this weekend. Dad says we're going to cook over a real fire and everything." Sophia's eyes lit up with anticipation. "Have you ever been camping?" Before Victoria could answer, Marcus appeared around the corner, his expression shifting from relaxed contentment to carefully controlled surprise as he recognized her. "Admiral Sterling," he said, his voice returning to the neutral professionalism she remembered from yesterday. "Afternoon, ma'am. Mr. Webb." Victoria nodded, then looked down at Sophia, who was watching this exchange with the sharp intelligence of a child who noticed adult undercurrents even when she didn't understand them. "And this must be Sophia?" Sophia beamed at being remembered, though Victoria hadn't actually heard her name until moments before. "Yes, ma'am. Are you a friend of Dad's?" The question hung in the air with the kind of innocent complexity that only children could create. Victoria found herself looking at Marcus, seeing him not as a mysterious contractor with hidden expertise, but as a father whose priority was clearly the bright, confident girl standing between them. "Your father helped me with a work problem yesterday," Victoria said carefully. "He's very good at fixing things." "Dad can fix anything," Sophia announced with absolute certainty. Cars, computers, even my bicycle, when the chain keeps falling off. He's super smart about mechanical stuff. Marcus placed a gentle, $1 hand on his daughter's shoulder, the gesture carrying both affection and a subtle signal that perhaps she shouldn't share quite so much personal information with strangers. Sophia, why don't you go pick out some trail mix for our hiking trip? I'll catch up with you in a minute. Okay, Dad. Sophia looked up at Victoria with the kind of serious expression that suggested she was about to share something important. My dad used to be a pilot, you know. He was really, really good at it. He told me he could make airplanes dance in the sky. Victoria felt her breath catch, glancing quickly at Marcus to see his reaction. His expression had gone very still, not angry, but clearly uncomfortable with his daughter's disclosure. Sophia, he said quietly. But it's true. Sophia continued, oblivious to her father's discomfort. He showed me pictures and everything. He had a special name that other pilots called him, like a superhero name. Victoria's pulse accelerated. She was about to hear confirmation of what she'd spent the morning researching, but from the innocent perspective of a daughter who clearly adored her father. What name was that? Victoria asked gently. Sophia looked up at her father, suddenly uncertain whether she was supposed to share this information. Marcus met her eyes and something passed between them, a conversation conducted entirely in the silent language of parents and children. It's okay, he said quietly. You can tell the Admiral. Sophia's face brightened again. Viper! Like the snake. But he wasn't scary. He was one of the good guys who protected people. The name hit Victoria like a physical blow. Even though she'd been expecting it, hearing it spoken by this innocent child, with such obvious pride and affection, made the reality of Marcus's identity settle into her consciousness in a way that personnel files and classified documents couldn't match. She looked at Marcus, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a mysterious contractor, but as a legendary pilot who'd sacrificed his career and identity to build a quiet life for his daughter. The knowledge changed everything about how she understood their interaction yesterday. But it also raised a dozen new questions about what had driven him to abandon everything he'd once been. Viper? Victoria repeated softly. That's quite a call sign. Marcus's expression remained carefully neutral, but she caught the slight tension around his eyes. A long time ago, he said quietly. Sophia tugged on his sleeve. Tell her about the time you saved all those people in the storm, Dad. That's my favorite story. Sophia, Marcus said gently but firmly, why don't you go find that trail mix? We need to finish shopping. The girl nodded and skipped away, leaving Victoria and Marcus alone in the cereal aisle with the weight of unspoken questions hanging between them like static electricity before a storm. She's beautiful, Victoria said finally. How old? 8, replied. And the light of my world. Victoria heard the depth of emotion in those simple words, recognizing the tone of a parent whose entire universe had reorganized itself around a child's well-being. It explained everything and nothing, why he was hiding his identity, why he'd left active duty, why he'd accepted a job that utilized only a fraction of his capabilities. Mr. Webb Marcus, she corrected herself. We need to talk. Marcus glanced toward where Sophia had disappeared among the grocery displays, clearly weighing the security of his daughter against whatever conversation Victoria wanted to have. About yesterday? He asked. About a lot of things, Victoria replied. But not here. Not now. Marcus nodded slowly. Sophia and I are leaving for camping this weekend. I'll be back Monday. Monday evening, Victoria said. My office, 1800 hours. It wasn't really a request. and they both understood that. Marcus met her eyes directly, and for a moment Victoria saw, past the careful contractor facade, to the man underneath, someone who'd carried enormous responsibilities, made impossible decisions, and was now trying to build something peaceful and normal for his daughter. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. Sophia reappeared with a bag of trail mix and the triumphant expression of someone who'd successfully completed a mission. "Found it! The kind with extra peanuts, just like you said." "Perfect," Marcus said, his voice warming instantly as his attention returned to his daughter. "Ready to check out?" "Ready." Sophia looked up at Victoria. "It was nice meeting you, ma'am. Maybe you can come camping with us sometime. Dad makes really good s'mores." Victoria felt something twist in her chest, a longing for the kind of simple family happiness that radiated from this child's innocent invitation. "Maybe someday," she said softly. As she watched Marcus and Sophia walk toward the checkout lanes, Victoria remained in the cereal aisle for several minutes, processing what had just happened. She'd solved the mystery of Marcus Webb's identity, but in doing so, she'd uncovered something far more complex than simple personnel management. Somewhere between the breakfast cereal and trail mix, she'd glimpsed a life built on sacrifice and love, anchored by a relationship between father and daughter that transcended rank, reputation, and the kind of glory that most people spent their entire careers chasing. Monday couldn't come fast enough. Victoria had questions that needed answers. But more than that, she had a growing suspicion that Marcus Webb Viper might need something that only she could provide, not as an admiral, but as someone who understood the weight of command and the price of service. As she finally selected her own groceries and headed toward checkout, Victoria found herself thinking not about personnel files or security protocols, but about a little girl who talked about airplanes dancing in the sky and a father who'd given up everything to make sure she could grow up believing the world was full of wonder rather than danger. The weekend passed slowly for Victoria, filled with routine administrative tasks and social obligations that felt suddenly hollow compared to the glimpse of genuine family life she'd witnessed in the commissary. She found herself thinking repeatedly about Sophia's bright enthusiasm and Marcus's gentle parenting, recognizing something she'd lost without realizing it during her climb through the ranks of Naval Command. Monday evening arrived with the kind of spring weather that made military bases feel almost peaceful. Warm air, carrying the scent of flowering trees, golden light that softened the harsh geometry of hangars and administrative buildings. Victoria had spent the afternoon reviewing Marcus's classified file again, trying to piece together the full story of how one of the Navy's most legendary pilots had ended up hiding his identity while fixing aircraft for a fraction of what his expertise was worth. At precisely 1800 hours, a knock on her office door announced Marcus's arrival. Victoria had positioned herself behind her desk, surrounded by the symbols of rank and authority that usually provided psychological advantage during difficult conversations. But when Marcus entered and stood at relaxed attention, she realized that all the trappings of command in the world couldn't change the fundamental dynamic between them. This wasn't a flag officer questioning a contractor about security violations. This was one naval aviator finally confronting another about choices that had shaped both their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. "Sit down, Marcus," she said, using his first name deliberately. "We have a lot to discuss." Marcus took the offered chair, his posture relaxed but alert. He'd changed from his usual coveralls into khakis and a polo shirt that somehow made him look younger. Less like a maintenance contractor and more like the combat pilot he'd once been. "I assume you've been busy since Friday," he said quietly. Victoria nodded. "I've read your file, the unclassified portions anyway." She leaned back in her chair, studying his face. Viper, one of the most decorated naval aviators of your generation. Combat missions that are still classified 15 years after they happened. Flight skills that other pilots talked about in whispers. Marcus's expression didn't change, but Victoria caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested old wounds being probed. "And now you're installing avionics panels in aircraft you used to fly in combat?" she continued. "Using expertise that could command six-figure consulting contracts to troubleshoot maintenance problems for contractor wages. Why?" The question hung between them, carrying weight that went far beyond professional curiosity. Victoria genuinely wanted to understand what could drive someone to abandon not just a career, but an entire identity built on excellence and service. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on something beyond the office windows. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful control of someone who'd learned to discuss painful topics without allowing emotion to overwhelm facts. "Do you have children, Admiral?" The question caught Victoria off guard. "No. Career didn't allow for it." Marcus nodded as if he'd expected that answer. Sophia's mother was also a naval aviator, Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez. "We met during a deployment to the Persian Gulf, served together on the same carrier." Victoria felt her chest tighten as she began to understand where this story was heading. In the close-knit world of naval aviation, relationships between pilots often became intensely personal, very quickly, forged by shared danger and mutual dependence that had no civilian equivalent. "She was killed in a training accident when Sophia was 3, Marcus continued, his voice steady, but carrying undertones of grief that 15 years hadn't diminished. Mechanical failure. During a routine flight, she was trying to make an emergency landing when the aircraft went down." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She'd lost friends and colleagues over the years, understood intellectually that military service carried risks that could destroy families without warning. But hearing it described in Marcus's quiet, controlled voice made the reality feel immediate and personal. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it completely. Marcus acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. "After Elena died, I had a choice. Continue flying, deploy regularly, and leave Sophia with relatives who barely knew her, or find a way to be the parent she needed while still using skills I'd spent my entire adult life developing." Victoria began to see the logic, but also the enormous sacrifice involved. "So you resigned your commission? Took an early retirement package? Accepted a civilian contractor position that would keep me close to aircraft, but allow me to maintain a stable home for Sophia?" Marcus met her eyes directly. Marcus met her eyes. "I gave up everything I'd been in order to become everything she needed." The simple statement carried more weight than any medal citation Victoria had ever read. Here was a man who'd voluntarily stepped away from the pinnacle of military aviation achievement, accepting anonymity and reduced status, because his daughter's well-being mattered more than his own professional fulfillment. "But you didn't have to hide your identity," Victoria pointed out. "Your service record could have opened doors, commanded respect, provided opportunities. That would have required explanation." Marcus interrupted gently. "Questions about why I left active duty, sympathy for my loss, well-meaning attempts to help. That would have made Sophia the daughter of a tragic hero, rather than just a kid whose dad fixes airplanes." He paused. "She deserves to grow up normal, Admiral, without carrying the weight of my past or her mother's sacrifice." Victoria felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of sacrifice on a scale she'd never truly contemplated. Her own career had been built on accumulating responsibility, authority, recognition, The idea of deliberately abandoning all of that for something as intangible as a child's emotional security was almost incomprehensible. But as she thought about Sophia's bright confidence in the commissary, her obvious security in her father's love, Victoria began to understand that Marcus had achieved something far more valuable than rank or reputation. She doesn't know, Victoria realized, about her mother's service, her sacrifice. She knows Elena was a pilot, that she died in an accident. When she's older, I'll tell her the full story. But right now, she just knows that her mom was brave, and that I love her enough to be here every day. Marcus's expression softened slightly. That's enough. For now. Victoria sat in silence for several minutes, processing implications that went far beyond the immediate personnel issue she'd thought she was addressing. Marcus Webb wasn't a security risk or an identity fraud case. He was a father who'd made a choice that most people would consider impossible, trading glory for presence, achievement for availability. The F-35 diagnostic, she said finally. You knew immediately what was wrong because you'd seen it before. Not as a contractor. Marcus nodded. Combat operations, about 8 years ago. Different aircraft, same symptoms. We lost 2 birds before we figured out the firmware corruption issue. His expression darkened slightly. Cost us a mission and nearly cost us more lives. Victoria felt the pieces click into place. You weren't just guessing Friday. You were remembering. Combat experience has a way of making certain lessons stick. Marcus agreed. When I saw those error patterns, I knew exactly what was causing them and how to fix place. The revelation added another layer to Victoria's understanding of what had happened. Marcus hadn't just solved a maintenance problem. He'd prevented potential catastrophic failure based on hard-won knowledge that had been paid for in blood and treasure during actual combat operations. Why didn't you say something? Explain your background. Claim credit for the solution? Marcus was quiet for a moment, then gave her a slight smile that carried more sadness than humor. Because then you would have asked exactly the questions you're asking now. And Sophia would have had to hear about her father being called back to active duty, or offered consulting positions that would require travel, or being recognized as some kind of hero when all he wants to be is her dad. Victoria felt her throat tighten with sudden emotion. She'd spent 30 years in an environment that measured success through advancement, recognition, and increasing responsibility. The idea of deliberately choosing obscurity for the sake of someone else's well-being was almost foreign to her experience. But it was also, she realized, the most powerful demonstration of leadership she'd ever encountered. Marcus had identified his most important mission, raising his daughter, and had reorganized his entire life to accomplish it successfully, regardless of personal cost. Admiral, Marcus said quietly, if my presence here creates complications for base security or operational concerns, I understand. I can submit my resignation and find work elsewhere. The offer hit Victoria like a punch to the solar plexus. Here was a man of extraordinary capability and dedication, offering to disappear again rather than create problems for others. The generosity of the gesture, combined with the waste it would represent, made her angry in a way that surprised her with its intensity. Absolutely not, she said firmly. What I'm wondering is how we can better utilize your expertise without compromising your talent. Priorities. Marcus looked genuinely surprised. Ma'am? Victoria leaned forward, her mind already working through possibilities. Marcus, you just saved my squadron from a maintenance disaster that could have taken weeks to resolve. Your knowledge and experience represent a resource that I'd be foolish to waste. She paused. But I also understand that your daughter comes first. So, the question is, how do we structure a role that serves both needs? For the first time since he'd entered her office, Marcus looked uncertain. I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Admiral. Victoria smiled, feeling the satisfaction that came with finding solutions to complex problems. I'm suggesting that the Navy would benefit from having a senior maintenance consultant with your background and expertise. Someone who could troubleshoot complex problems, provide training to our technical teams, and serve as a liaison between operational requirements and maintenance capabilities. She paused. A position that would allow you to remain in the local area, maintain your current schedule, and continue being the father Sophia needs. Marcus stared at her for several seconds, clearly processing implications and possibilities. You're offering me a promotion. I'm offering you recognition, Victoria corrected, and the opportunity to contribute at the level your expertise deserves while maintaining the life you've built for your daughter. The office fell silent. As Marcus considered the proposal, Victoria watched emotions play across his face. Hope, wariness, and something that looked like relief at the possibility of finally being able to use his full capabilities without sacrificing his primary mission. There would be conditions, Victoria continued. Your background would need to be disclosed to certain personnel for security purposes. You'd be asked to provide technical consultation on complex maintenance issues, and occasionally, you might need to travel for training or conferences. But I'd still be home every evening, Marcus said slowly. Still be able to coach Sophia's soccer team, help with homework, be present for the daily things that matter. That's exactly right, Victoria confirmed, because, from what I've observed, those daily things have made you into something far more valuable than just an exceptional pilot. They've made you into an exceptional father. And that's a kind of leadership we need more of, not less. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he looked up, Victoria saw tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. Why? He asked quietly. Why would you do this for someone you barely know? Victoria considered her answer carefully, recognizing that this conversation had become about far more than personnel management or operational efficiency. Because watching you with Sophia reminded me of something I'd forgotten, she said finally. Service isn't just about the mission. It's about the people we're protecting, the families we're in protection, keeping safe, the future we're trying to build. She paused. You've never stopped serving, Marcus. You just changed the scope of your mission. The silence that followed was comfortable, full of mutual understanding and respect that transcended rank or official relationships. I'd like to accept, Marcus said finally, with the understanding that Sophia's needs take priority over everything else. Agreed, Victoria replied immediately. We'll structure the position to accommodate that requirement. As they discussed details and logistics, Victoria found herself thinking not about promotion protocols or administrative procedures, but about a little girl who would go to sleep that night, knowing her father had been recognized for the exceptional person he'd always been. And for the first time in years, she wondered what it would be like to have someone like Sophia, someone whose happiness mattered more than any career achievement, waiting for her to come home each evening. 3 weeks. Into Marcus's new role as senior technical consultant, the fragile equilibrium he'd built around his daughter's happiness came under assault from a direction he'd never anticipated. It started with a phone call that arrived at 0600 on a Tuesday morning, shattering the peaceful routine of breakfast preparation and homework checks that had anchored their lives for nearly 2 decades. Dad? Sophia's voice carried from the kitchen, where she was methodically arranging her school supplies with the precision he'd unconsciously taught her. Your phone's buzzing really loud. Marcus glanced at the secure line display and felt his stomach drop. The number belonged to Pentagon Personnel Management, the kind of call that usually preceded life-altering orders or requests that came disguised as opportunities but felt more like commands. Marcus Webb? The voice was crisp, efficient, carrying the tone of someone accustomed to delivering news that rearranged other people's lives. Speaking. "This is Captain Rodriguez from Naval Personnel Command. Sir, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. Are you familiar with the hostage situation developing in Somalia?" Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded combat deployments, the physiological response to danger that had kept him alive through countless missions, but now threatened the peaceful life he'd built for Sophia. "I've seen the news reports," he said carefully, moving into his home office and closing the door. "Sir, we have assets on the ground, but the extraction is being complicated by surface-to-air threats that exceed our current operational parameters." The mission commander specifically requested consultation with someone who has experience in similar scenarios. A pause. "Your name came up at the highest levels." Marcus closed his eyes, understanding immediately why his expertise was suddenly valuable. Somalia meant close air support in contested airspace, precision strikes in urban environments, the kind of flying that required skills and experience that couldn't be taught in simulators or acquired through routine training. "I'm a civilian contractor," he said, though they both knew the distinction was meaningless when lives hung in the balance. "We're prepared to offer temporary reactivation under emergency authority, 48 to 72 hours maximum. Transportation to Djibouti leaves Norfolk at 1400 hours today." Through the office door, Marcus could hear Sophia humming while she packed her lunch. The sound of innocence and security that he'd spent 8 years protecting. The choice before him was stark. Abandon the mission that had given his life meaning for the past decade, or step away from operational requirements that could mean the difference between life and death for hostages he'd never met. "I need to consider—" "Mr. Webb," Captain Rodriguez interrupted. "We have 37 civilians being held by a PEN, terrorist organization that's threatened to execute them in stages if their demands aren't met. The window for successful rescue is closing rapidly." Marcus felt the weight of command settle back onto his shoulders like a familiar uniform he'd hoped never to wear again. Somewhere in Somalia, people were depending on decisions made by individuals they'd never meet, trusting that the machinery of American military capability would function when their lives depended on it. But in his kitchen, an 8-year-old girl was depending on him to be present for soccer practice, homework help, and bedtime stories. The daily commitments that had become his most important mission. "I'll call you back within the hour," Marcus said finally. The conversation with Sophia was harder than any combat briefing he'd ever endured. She listened with the serious expression she wore when processing information that would affect her world. Her dark eyes searching his face for reassurance. He wasn't sure he could provide. "So, you might have to go away for a few days?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled in the way children learned when they'd experienced too much loss too early. "Maybe," Marcus admitted. "It would be to help some people who are in trouble. But I want you to know that nothing is more important to me than being your dad." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, then reached for his hand with the kind of simple gesture that contained more trust than any military decoration. "The people who are in trouble," she said slowly, "are they scared like I was when Mom didn't come home?" The question hit Marcus like shrapnel, precisely targeted to the part of his heart where guilt and responsibility intersected. Sophia rarely mentioned her mother's death directly, but when she did, it usually signaled that she was processing fears she couldn't fully articulate. "Yes," he said honestly. "They're probably very scared." Sophia nodded, with the wisdom of a child who'd learned that sometimes adults had to make difficult choices for reasons that extended beyond immediate family needs. "If you go help them, will you come back?" she asked. "I will always come back to you," Marcus promised, meaning it with every cell in his body. Always. That afternoon, Marcus found himself in Admiral Sterling's office, explaining a situation that threatened to destroy the careful balance they'd only recently established. Victoria listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grim as she understood the implications. "They specifically requested you," she said when he finished. "Emergency reactivation to provide tactical consultation and possible direct participation in hostage rescue operations." Marcus confirmed. 72 hours maximum, but we both know how these things can expand once they're underway. Victoria studied his face, clearly processing multiple layers of concern that went beyond simple personnel management. "What do you want to do?" she asked. The question surprised him. He'd expected orders, explanations of duty and obligation, appeals to his sense of service. Instead, she was asking for his personal assessment of a situation that had no clear right answer. "Professionally, I know I can contribute to a mission that could save lives," Marcus said slowly. "Personally, I know that leaving Sophia, even temporarily, violates every principle I've built my life around since Elena died." Victoria nodded, understanding the genuine conflict. "What does Sophia think?" Marcus felt his chest tighten as he remembered their conversation. "She gave me permission to help people who are scared the way she was when she lost her mother." The words hung between them, carrying weight that transcended military protocol or operational requirements. Victoria felt something twist in her chest as she recognized the extraordinary emotional intelligence of a child who could understand sacrifice in terms that many adults couldn't grasp. "There's another option," Victoria said finally. Marcus looked up, surprised by her tone. "I could go instead." The suggestion hit Marcus like a physical blow. "Admiral, you're not qualified for this type of mission. Close air support in contested airspace requires specific experience, and that you could provide through remote consultation," Victoria interrupted. "Real-time communication, tactical guidance, mission planning support. You could contribute your expertise without leaving Sophia." Marcus stared at her, processing implications that seemed too good to be true. "You'd do that? Put yourself at risk to keep me home with my daughter?" Victoria's expression softened, in a way that revealed layers of emotion she rarely allowed others to see. "Marcus, 3 weeks ago, you reminded me that service isn't just about the mission. It's about the people we're protecting, the families we're keeping safe." She paused. "Maybe it's time I learned what that means in practice." The proposal was unconventional, technically challenging, and personally dangerous for Victoria. But as they worked through the details, Marcus began to see how it could work. His tactical expertise, combined with her command authority and current flight status, could provide the mission planners with the knowledge they needed while allowing him to remain physically present for Sophia. 2 hours later, Victoria was boarding a transport to Norfolk, while Marcus established a secure communications center in the base operations facility. For the next 72 hours, he would be her eyes and ears, providing tactical guidance while she flew missions that would test every skill she'd developed over 3 decades of naval aviation. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. She was risking her life to preserve his family life, while he was providing remote support for missions he'd once flown personally. It was a partnership born of mutual respect and shared understanding that some things mattered more than conventional approaches to military problems. If you've been following this story, this is the moment where everything changes. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this extraordinary partnership transforms both their lives forever. The first mission brief came through at 0200 hours, delivered via encrypted satellite link, while Sophia slept peacefully in her room and Marcus worked through tactical scenarios that could mean the difference between successful rescue and catastrophic failure. The hostage situation had deteriorated. Intelligence suggested that executions would begin at dawn, unless immediate action was taken. The rescue force was in position, but surface-to-air threats had evolved beyond initial estimates, requiring precision flying and tactical decisions that pushed operational parameters to their limits. Victoria's voice came through the secure communication system with crystal clarity, despite the thousands of miles between them. "Viper, this is Overwatch. I'm airborne with full ordnance load, approaching the target area, requesting tactical assessment and guidance." Hearing his call sign, spoken aloud for the first time in 8 years, sent electricity through Marcus's nervous system. For a moment, he was back in the cockpit, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility that came with holding other people's lives in his hands. "Overwatch, Viper has you on scope. Threat assessment indicates multiple mobile SAM sites with overlapping coverage patterns. Recommend approach from bearing 270, using terrain masking until final attack run. Copy. Viper, adjusting approach vector." For the next 6 hours, Marcus guided Victoria through a complex rescue operation that required flying skills at the absolute edge of human capability. He watched through real-time video feeds as she executed maneuvers that he'd once performed personally, providing tactical guidance while she translated his expertise into action. The mission was successful. 37 hostages were recovered with minimal casualties. The terrorist threat was neutralized, and Victoria demonstrated flying skills that earned immediate recognition from mission commanders who'd worked with the best pilots in the world. But for Marcus, the real victory was being present when Sophia woke up, available to make breakfast and help with homework, as if nothing extraordinary had happened during the night hours when most children slept. "Dad," Sophia said over morning cereal, "you look tired. Did you stay up late working on something important?" "Something very important," Marcus confirmed, thinking about hostages who were now safe with their families, and a woman who'd risked her life to ensure he could remain present for his daughter's daily needs. 3 days later, Victoria returned to base with a chest full of new decorations and a perspective on service that had been fundamentally altered by her experience. But the most significant change wasn't professional, it was personal. She'd discovered something about herself during those 72 hours of combat operations conducted partly for the sake of preserving someone else's family life. The knowledge that Marcus was safely at home with Sophia, providing tactical support while remaining physically present for his daughter, had given her missions a sense of purpose that went beyond traditional military objectives. She'd been fighting not just for hostages in Somalia, but for the principle that exceptional people shouldn't have to choose between serving their country and serving their families. The debriefing session in her office felt different from their previous conversations. Both Marcus and Victoria had been changed by their shared experience, though neither was yet certain how to articulate the transformation. "The mission commanders want you back on active duty," Victoria said without preamble. "Full reinstatement, immediate promotion to command of your own squadron." Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest. And Sophia would become the daughter of a squadron commander, with deployment schedules, training requirements, and operational commitments that would take you away from home 6 months out of every year. The stark assessment hung between them, highlighting the fundamental conflict that no amount of recognition or career opportunity could resolve. Marcus had made his choice 8 years ago, and nothing that had happened in Somalia changed the basic equation of what Sophia needed from him. "I'm honored by the offer," Marcus said carefully, "but my answer remains the same." Victoria smiled, and for the first time since she'd known him, Marcus saw something in her expression that looked like relief rather than disappointment. "That's what I told them you'd say," she admitted. "Which is why I made a counter-proposal." Marcus looked up, surprised by her tone. "A new position. Senior Tactical Advisor for Special Operations Support, based permanently at Oceana. No deployment requirements, no transfer obligations, no command responsibilities that would take you away from Sophia." Victoria leaned forward. "But full access to operational planning, mission consultation, and the kind of challenging work that uses every skill you've developed over 20 years of service." The offer was everything Marcus hadn't dared to hope for. Recognition of his capabilities without sacrifice of his priorities, professional fulfillment that accommodated rather than competed with his role as Sophia's father. "Why?" he asked quietly. Victoria's expression softened with emotions she'd only recently learned to acknowledge. "Because watching you choose your daughter over glory reminded me of something I'd forgotten. The people who are willing to sacrifice everything for someone else's well-being are exactly the people we need making decisions about other people's lives." The conversation continued for another hour, working through details and logistics that would formalize Marcus's new role. But the most important exchange happened in the final moments, when professional discussion gave way to personal revelation. "Admiral," Marcus said, as he prepared to leave, "thank you for understanding what matters, for risking yourself to preserve it, for creating something that seemed impossible." Victoria stood, moved by an impulse she didn't fully understand. "Marcus, I have a confession. Flying those missions in Somalia, knowing you were home with Sophia, gave me a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. Fighting for something beyond just mission accomplishment. Protecting something that mattered in a way I'd never understood." Marcus studied her face, seeing vulnerability that flag officers rarely revealed. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe the most important things in life aren't about individual achievement. Maybe they're about the connections we build, the people we protect, the families we help keep whole." Victoria paused, gathering courage for words she'd never spoken before. "And maybe I'd like to understand that better." The invitation was subtle, but unmistakable. Not a romantic proposition, exactly, but an expression of interest in exploring whatever was developing between them: professional respect, personal admiration, and something deeper that neither was yet ready to name directly. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of possibility he'd thought was permanently closed to him. But his first thought, as always, was for Sophia. "My daughter comes first," he said quietly. "That's exactly what makes you the kind of person worth knowing better." As Marcus left her office, both of them understood that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. Professional collaboration had evolved into personal connection, mutual respect had deepened into something approaching affection. And both had discovered that the most meaningful service often involved protecting the things that mattered most to other people. That evening, Marcus returned home to find Sophia practicing soccer in their small backyard. Her determination and focus reminiscent of her mother's approach to everything she'd considered important. Watching his daughter pursue her goals with Elena's intensity and his own quiet persistence, Marcus felt a sense of completion he'd never expected to experience again. "Dad!" Sophia called out as he approached. "Watch this." She executed a complex move that would have impressed coaches twice her age. Then looked at him with the bright expectation of a child seeking approval from the person whose opinion mattered most. "That was amazing," Marcus said, meaning it completely. "When did you learn to do that?" "Coach Sarah taught us yesterday. She said natural athletes have to work twice as hard as everyone else because people expect more from them." Sophia paused, then added with surprising wisdom, Kind of like how really good pilots have to choose what's most important when they can't do everything. The comment hit Marcus with unexpected force, recognizing in his daughter's words an understanding of sacrifice and priority that most adults struggled to achieve. "Sophia," he said gently, "how would you feel about me inviting a friend over for dinner sometime? Someone who's helped Daddy with some important work problems." Sophia stopped practicing and gave him the kind of serious look that suggested she understood the significance of the question. "Is it Admiral Sterling?" she asked. "Because she looked at you the way people look at things they want to understand better. And she looked at me like she thought I was lucky to have you as my dad." Sophia resumed her ball handling, then added casually, "Besides, you've been smiling more since you started working with her." The observation was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone children used when stating obvious truths that adults somehow managed to miss. Marcus found himself laughing, recognizing that his 8-year-old daughter had identified emotional patterns he'd been struggling to understand himself. "So, you'd be okay with that?" he asked. "Dad, if she makes you happy the way you make me happy, then I think that's good." Sophia paused her practice again. "But she has to like soccer, and she has to promise never to make you choose between her and me." The conditions were stated with absolute clarity, quote, revealing the wisdom of a child who'd learned to protect the most important relationships in her life. Marcus knelt beside his daughter, overwhelmed by the depth of her emotional intelligence. "Those seem like very reasonable requirements," he said softly. "Good. Then you should probably invite her over this weekend. I want to show her my room and my drawings of airplanes." As the sun set over their bussa, small backyard, Marcus watched his daughter practice with determination that would have made Elena proud, while contemplating possibilities he'd never imagined could coexist with the life he'd built around her happiness. For the first time since Elena's death, Marcus began to believe that love might not always require choosing between competing priorities. Maybe, if he was very careful and very lucky, it was possible to build something larger without sacrificing what he already had. The thought was both terrifying and wonderful, like standing on the edge of something that could either destroy everything he'd worked to protect, or expand it in ways that would make their small family stronger and happier than he'd ever dared to hope. 3 hours later, Victoria's phone rang while she was reviewing deployment schedules that no longer seemed as important as they had that morning. "Admiral Sterling? This is Marcus. I was wondering if you'd like to come over for dinner this Saturday. Sophia insists on showing you her airplane drawings, and I'd like to cook for someone who understands what it means to put family first." Victoria felt her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with military operations and everything to do with the possibility that she might finally understand what she'd been missing during 30 years of putting career before everything else. "I'd love to," she said simply. And as she hung up the phone, Victoria realized that the most important mission of her life might just be learning how to be part of the family that Marcus and Sophia had built through love, sacrifice, and the kind of daily dedication that never made headlines but created the foundation for everything that truly mattered. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.